starting.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Again, as Kate mentioned, my name is Alec Johnson. I am the E-rate consultant that has been hired by MBLC to help shepherd Massachusetts libraries through the E-rate application process. This presentation, Getting Prepared for E-rate, is the second in a series of presentations that we'll be doing. The next presentation will be coming in about 2 weeks. And that presentation will actually cover the first form in the E-rate process, the Form 470, and the steps that you should take as part of that Form 470 process. But today, what we're going to talk about are all the things that you need to do before you're ready to file. So we're going to talk about the different kinds of accounts that you need to set up, and we'll do some demonstrations of how to log in and check those accounts, see if they already exist. If they don't exist, how to go ahead and set those up. And if they do exist, what information you need to pull from the accounts and have in your files. We'll also talk at the end of today's presentation about some of the do's and don'ts that you should follow as we start to edge up to the procurement phase, which is where the first form in the process, the Form 470, comes in, and some of the steps that you should take just to make sure that you are well prepared for that. So, one other thing, everyone should have received a copy of all of these slides via email yesterday. If you did not get a copy of the slides, go ahead and drop a note in the chat. And we can upload a copy of the slides there so that you'll have those. I apologize. I know these slides are long and verbose. That is by design. And it's because they're set up so that you can refer back to them in the future. These are really meant to be reference materials. So to that end, yes, I'm well aware. For adult education, we probably should have less information on slides, but I want you to be able to go back to these and be able to actually follow the train of thought as to what was going on, rather than just having a couple of keywords on a PowerPoint slide and say, okay, well, what did that mean? So that's why they're set up the way they are. So first, we're going to go ahead and talk about different accounts. And the first account we're going to talk about is the FCC registration number, or FCCRN. The FCC registration number is it's an account you set up with the Federal Communications Commission. You only need to set it up once. And so most libraries, if they did set it up, would have done so almost 20 years ago when the FCC started requiring this. It is just the whole point of this from an E-rate perspective is to get a unique identifier, that FCCRN, which you then need linked to your library. So that's the whole reason we go through this, is because you need this number in order to apply for E-rate. Your FCC registration number is linked to the employer identification number, or EIN, for your library. And so depending on how your library is set up, you may already have an FCC registration number either under your library or potentially under any other entity that also shares your EIN. So, for example, if your library uses the same EIN as the town may have an FCC registration number already, which you could potentially use. You could also set up a new FCC registration number using that same EIN. And so what we're going to do today is we'll walk through how to search and find whether you already have an FCC registration number. And if you do, great. All you need to do is pull that number, and you don't need to worry about setting up an account. If you don't already have an FCC registration number, we'll walk through the steps that you need to go through in order to get one. So to that end, the first step that you have to go through is to go to the Federal Communications Commission's website, which is SAM.gov. And we're going to start by just going through and doing a quick search to see if there is an FCC registration number. And throughout today's training, incidentally, I'm going to be picking on the Swampscott Public Library. I did that primarily because, to the best of my knowledge, there's only one Swampscott in the United States, and so that makes it an easy name to search for being unique, which will make our training a little bit easier. But we could have done this, theoretically using any particular library name. So to search for the FCC registration number, you need to go in and check a database that's hosted by the Federal Communications Commission, which is called CORS, C-O-R-E-S. So you go to fcc.gov, you mouse over where it says licensing and databases, and then click on the CORS database down here. Once you're at this CORS, which stands for Commission Registration System, once you're at the CORS website, to go ahead and search for an FCC registration number, you click down here where it says search for public FRN information. I should take this opportunity to talk about the frustrating nomenclature here, because the FCC refers to their registration numbers as FRNs. In E-rate, we don't refer to them as FRNs because FRN is it refers to the funding request number that gets used elsewhere in the program. So while on the website here, they may talk about it as an FRN, I'm going to try to consistently refer to it as an FCCRN to distinguish it. So we're going to search for public FCCRN information. What we can do here is we can search by one of a variety of different criteria. I'm going to go ahead and choose to search by name. And so we're going to search by business name. Now, it's important to note that for the CORS database, it includes a ton of different entities that have a variety of different purposes. Everyone who gets a radio license of any sort will be included in this. So that's going to include, most of your police departments, fire departments. It's also going to include a ton of ham radio operators, people who happen to have broadcast licenses for boats, all kinds of stuff. Again, this is why using something like Swampscott becomes easier because there are fewer entities listed. Now, it does allow you to use a wildcard search, and so I strongly recommend that you do so. So I'm going to search for Swampscott followed by an asterisk, which is the wildcard search symbol. Go ahead and click search, and you'll see that I've got 5 different entities that come up as having licenses where Swampscott is in the name. I've got 2 for the town of Swampscott, 1 for the town Department of Public Works, 1 for the library, and 1 for the public schools. For our purposes, basically, if we were trying to apply as Swampscott, what we need to do is make sure that we have the FCC registration number. We simply copy this information right here and put it in our files. Or you can click on the FCC registration number and then just print this off for your files. That works too. One important thing to note about the FCC registration number is that it does not expire. So you'll note that this FCC registration was applied for back in 2004, doesn't look like it's been updated significantly since then, and doesn't need to be because of the way the system works, where these numbers do not expire. So keeping that in mind, if you do not find an FCC registration number for your library, you may need to register with the CORS system. And there are 2 steps to that. The first is setting up a user account within the CORS system. And so in order to do that, back at the page that we were at before, where previously we had clicked on search for public FRN or FCCRN information, to set up a user account, you just click where it says register and update username account. That'll bring up this page here where they ask you to register with the FCC, and you'll click create a new account. The account setup is very standard. The username that they request is that you use an email address for your username. You have to put in a password. It's has all of the standard requirements for a password: 12 to 15 characters, uppercase, lowercase, number, and a symbol. And then they ask for a bunch of additional information about your name and that sort of stuff. For the user side of things, this is very simple. It's very straightforward, and the only at all unusual thing, which isn't really all that unusual, is that you're required to put in a security question. Some of the security questions are a little bit unusual, but it's okay. You can always recover your account information based on your email address if you need to. Once you've created this account, and the account creation process is virtually instantaneous, they will send you an email indicating that your account has been created, which is great. They will also, after you click Create Account, it will forward you to this page where you can log in using the information for the account that you have just created. So the second step is to associate your entity to your account. And that is where you would say associate your public library to the account that you've just created. So to do that, you need to log into your account. And then it brings up the user homepage where there are a couple of different options. One of those options is to register a new FRN, or FCCRN in this case. This process is also really straightforward, but there's one thing that I want to be sure to mention to you because the options are a little bit confusing. Again, remember that this system was set up primarily to register entities that have radio licenses. So it's primarily companies, individuals who are doing, amateur broadcasting stuff, and to some extent, statewide or local government entities. What they didn't count on was putting in libraries, because libraries aren't, typically heavy users of radio frequency. And so the way this was set up, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for libraries. So I want to be sure you know what options to put in. So once you click on Register New FRN, it asks you what kind of registration you're doing, individual or entity. In this case, it would be an entity because you're talking about the library. Presumably, your contact address is within the United States, so you would select yes for that, and then simply click Continue. Here's where it gets a little bit confusing. Under Entity Type, there's a whole long drop-down with different options. And the type that you want to choose is state or local agency. And then it asks you for a subtype. And as this slide shows on the right-hand side, again, there's a whole drop-down. I couldn't show the drop-down in the slide, but the option you want to select under state or local agency is just Other. Other than that, the information here is all pretty standard. The one thing that you might not have at your fingertips that you need in order to complete this FCC registration number is that EIN, the employer identification number that we talked about earlier. That's the same as the taxpayer ID number. It should be something that whoever handles the books for your library can find quite easily. It's the equivalent of a Social Security number for any entity that does taxes or otherwise interacts with the federal government. Other than that, all of the information that they request is simple address information. And once you click Submit, again, the FCC process is virtually instantaneous, and you will get your FCC registration number. That number, which is here, shown highlighted and circled, that would be the number that you would save. You print this page off, keep it for your records. You'll need that FCC registration number when we go into Epic, which is what we're going to talk about in just a moment. So as I mentioned, that FCC registration number, it's assigned almost immediately. It does not expire. And the most important thing, once you have your FCC registration number, you can go ahead and tackle the next step in this process, which is getting registered in the portal that USAC uses for the applications. That portal is called EPC, or the E-Rate Productivity Center. EPC was set up specifically for the purpose of doing E-Rate applications, and we will spend a lot of time in EPC over the coming trainings as we work through all the different steps in the application process, because within a week, they should have consolidated almost all of those processes into the EPC portal. So you'll file all your applications through EPC. EPC has user databases, so everybody who is associated with your entity who's going to interact with E-Rate will need to get their own user account. They also have entity level accounts. So your library will have its own entity information. And the key thing that we're going to be trying to do here is make sure first that your library has an account, And second, that there is a user who can log in and administer information associated with that library account, including, when necessary, doing things like applying for E-rate. So that's what we're going to walk through, is how to check for that today. And if you don't have those things, how to go ahead and get those things. If you don't have the account for your library and if you don't have the account for your users. Critically, in order to set up an account for the library, one of the necessary pieces of information is the FCC registration number that we just talked about. So that's why we started there. So just because we like to make things even more complicated, we just got a unique identifier, the FCC registration number for your library. Within EPC, you'll need that FCC registration number, but we're going to assign yet another unique identifier for your library as well, which is called a build entity number, or BEN. Every library should already have a build entity number. We have worked with USAC over the last couple of weeks to go over their list of all of the libraries that they have in EPC, and to provide them with a list of libraries that need to have build entity numbers created. That is still in process, but we are hopeful that within about a week, USAC will have all of those created and will have the proper structures in place for all of the libraries. What do I mean by the proper structures? Well, if you're a library system, say you're a library with 3 branches, you end up needing 4 different build entity numbers, one for the library system, and then one for each of your 3 branches as well. So we've been working with USAC to try and set all of that up. I can't guarantee it's going to be perfect, but we have been trying really hard to make that happen. Assuming you already have a build entity number, all you need to do, or all you may need to do, is make sure that there's a user account that has been created and associated with that build entity number so that someone can administer it. If you have not applied for E-rate in the past, chances are pretty good you don't yet have that user account. Don't worry, we're going to cover that in just a moment as to how to set that up. However, before you do that, you need to make sure that you have that build entity number. And so the easiest way to do that is to use the link that is included in the slide to go to a tool called the Entity Search tool within the database that USAC maintains. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here real quickly. Let's go back, visit our friends in Chrome. So if you click on that link, it should take you to this page right here, which is a direct link into the entity search tool within USAC's Open Data portal. The Open Data portal has a ton of information about E-rate applications, and it's really an incredibly useful resource. The only problem is that it's not a particularly user-friendly series of resources. Because it has so much information, they've had a hard time putting together a front end that makes a huge amount of sense. So that has been a challenge, shall we say. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to continue to pick on our friends at Swampscott and try to find them within the system. To find an individual build entity number, what you want to do is use these controls on the right-hand side to filter down to find all of the different entities. So you'll see, if you look at this chart over here, it tells you how many school entities there are in the EPC database, 164,000 and change. How many school district entities, 24,000 and change. How many library entities, 22,000 and change. How many library systems, just shy of 2,000. So you could click on these and get a listing, for example, of all 22,000 libraries, and then try to filter your way through that. But these controls over here on the right-hand side make this at least a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and click where it says entity name. And you'll see I have a drop-down box where it allows me to search and say entity name is, and then I can put a value. I'm going to change the is to a contains, so that it does a broader search. And I'm just going to type Swampscott and then click apply. And you'll see that the chart here has changed a little bit. We have 2 schools, 1 school district, and 1 library with the word Swampscott in their name. So we can then scroll down and see what all of those are in this table down here at the bottom. you'll see that there is a library, and if let's pull that a little bit wider, you'll see it's the Swampscott Public Library. Its build entity number right here is 120419. It is part of the North of Boston Library Exchange, and it's a member of a consortium. There's all kinds of information about it here. For our purposes, the key piece of information is this build entity number 120419. That confirms that the entity already exists. So if I was applying on behalf of Swampscott, I don't need to worry about whether they have a build entity number. They already do. However, if we weren't able to find the build entity number and we needed to create one, the process for doing so is not super complicated, but it does require some information be provided. You need to reach out to USAC, and unfortunately, if you don't already have an account in EPC, the only way to do that is by phone. So you call them at the 888 number that is on the slide, 888-203-8100, and you tell them you need to create an entity number and a user account to administer that entity number. For the entity, they'll ask you to provide a variety of pieces of information, most of which are fairly straightforward. You know, the name, the address, what county you're located in, your phone number. Then there are a couple of things that get a little bit more esoteric. So they'll ask for that FCC registration number. Fortunately, we already have that because we checked over on the FCC side and either pulled down the existing FCC registration number or applied for one and received it. They will also ask you what school district your main library is located in. Now, every library system in E-Rate needs to have a main library. If you are an independent library where there's just the one library, that library is considered your main library. But if you are a larger system, you need to identify which is your main branch or your main library outlet, rather, the headquarters library, if you will. And that needs to be identified as to which school district it's located in. The reason they need that information is because, remember, the discount in E-Rate that you receive is based on the National School Lunch Program eligibility in the school district for which your main library is located. So that's why they need that information there. They'll also ask you to provide your urban or rural status. I actually recommend that folks provide that or push back a little bit on that and ask them to look it up for you, simply because they have a tool that allows them to find that rather easily. It's much more difficult for you to pull that urban or rural status. They'll also ask you for a variety of library type information. For most of your libraries, the main things you need to be concerned about, you're going to be a public library. If you're part of a library system, you'll indicate that you're part of the library system. And if the library in question is your main library, you'll indicate that, that it's a main library. You may also, if you're part of what in E-Rate terms is considered a library consortium, and in Massachusetts terms, it's just the networks. If you are part of one of the networks, you'll want to indicate that here as well. The last thing that they will ask for is the square footage of your library. That information is available from IMLS, but it's also part of what MBLC has been working with USAC to update. So of the 400 or so libraries in the state of Massachusetts, USAC had incorrect library square footage on about 300 of them. So we have provided them with that updated information. By the time you are getting around to working with USAC, hopefully that information has already been updated. The second step of this, as we mentioned before, is the user account. So even if your library already has a build entity number, it may not have any users associated with it. And if there are no users associated with it, then you run into the problem of nobody can administer the account. So you'll need to reach out to USAC using that same 888 number and ask them to set up an account. The account setup is much simpler. Every user account requires that you have an email address, a name, a title, and basically whether the user in question is going to be the administrator for the entity within the USAC database. That request usually needs to get emailed into USAC on letterhead, but the process, again, is actually quite simple. The only problem is it often takes them several days to process these things, so don't expect it to turn around right away, which means, again, you need to plan things out a little bit in advance. The key piece here is whether the user in question is considered to be the account administrator. Because the account administrator is the one who is going to control all of the rights for all of the users within EPC. Excuse me. All right. I know all of that is confusing on some level. I think it'll be a little bit easier once we actually go into EPC and sort of see what all of this stuff looks like, which of course you can't do until you've set up the accounts. So our next step is going to assume that you already have a build entity number set up, whether it existed before or you've set it up directly with USAC, and that you've set up a user account that has those administrator rights. The next step that you need to go through is to then just go in and verify that USAC has put in all of the correct entity information for your library. So let's take a look at what that looks like real quickly. Let me go ahead and log in. I'm going to log in as a library system for starters, because that's a little bit cleaner, and that's what is in your slides as well. But we will show what it looks like for an independent library, meaning a library that doesn't have multiple outlets right afterwards, just to show you, because it's basically the same process, but it's a little less complicated. For a library system, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go ahead and make sure that they have, for my library system, all of my branches set up properly, that the main library has all of the appropriate information and shows the school district, etc. This particular system that we're looking at right now is actually USAC's training system. So this looks almost identical to EPC and what you would be seeing. It's just slightly different in a couple of places where they haven't updated it. But none of that should change the basic flow here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on the library system name. This library system was given the very inventive name of Library System 10036, which is a fake library system in the state of Maryland. So once I click on the library name, it gives me some basic information about the library. It gives the address for the library system. Again, this is for the system, not for any of the particular outlets, but for the system as a whole. Critically, it tells me who the administrator is, the also incredibly interestingly named first name, last name, and also indicates that they are the general contact for the library system. It gives me the Category 2 budget information down here at the bottom, which is the square footage of all of my branches put together. And it tells me at the very bottom which branch is my main library branch. That main branch, again, is the one that's used to calculate the discount rate. So all of that looks good, but I want to be sure that they've included all of the information related to this particular library system and both of its branches. So in order to do that, I need to go down another layer or two of information in the EPC database. I'm going to go ahead and click on additional information, and that brings up a drop down here, which when I click on category, there's only one option, related organizations, which is a little bit misleading because I don't think of library branches as organizations separate from a library system. But the way that USAC has configured this, it doesn't just refer to library branches, it refers to a variety of other kinds of organizations that a library can be related to. So that's why they use the nomenclature, which is a little misleading. The three options that we have here are consortium members, consulting firms, and related entities. Now, to look up library branches, we're going to go ahead and click on related entities, but I want to explain what the other two are as well. So consortium members would be any other members of the same library network. So if you're part of Noble, for example, like our friends in Swampscott, if we were in their EPC profile and clicked on consortium members, it would show the Noble Consortium, and we could click on that and it would show all of the different members of the Noble Consortium. The same would be true, if you're part of sales or one of the other library networks. Consulting firms shows anybody who you've hired as a consultant and associated with your library within EPC. And your consultant, if you hire one, can help walk you through that process. But every consultant also has an account within EPC that they need to have set up so that they can assist you with your applications. The last option is related entities, which is kind of a catch-all. In this case, it means if you're a library system, it's your library outlets. If you're a school district, it would be your schools. So we'll click on related entities. And that shows now our 2 library branches for this library system. The first one of which is the main library, which has been creatively named Main Library for System 10036. And then we have a second library, which is the Dudley Branch Library. If you click on either of these, it's going to take you to look at the profile information for that particular library outlet. So in this case, once I pull up the profile information for the main library, it gives me all of the information associated with that library. So I've got all the information in Epic that it has with respect to the address, both physical and mailing. If there's a website, it has that information, what email address should be used for the library system. Normally, within the main EPC system, it will do things like pull up your latitude and longitude for the library system. It'll also put in a urban-rural status for you automatically based on the address. So that's why I urge you to push back a little bit on USAC to make them put that information in, because they have an easy tool to do that. The key things, however, to note, first we have our library subtypes, which are these options here. For pretty much every library, you're going to check public library. I'm not quite sure why private library is an option. I don't know of any private libraries really that are part of the E-rate system. Academic libraries are also an option, academic and research, but generally those are not eligible for E-rate. So it's a little bit interesting that they are in the system. So you're going to select public library. If this entity were your bookmobile, you would select bookmobile as an option. If this entity is your main branch, you would select your main branch. Just make sure that you've checked all of the entity categories that apply to the library outlet in question. If your library is part of a larger library system, you also want to be sure that this library system option over here on the left is marked as yes. And if you're looking at your main library, you want to make sure that the school district is appropriately identified here as well, because again, that relates into your discount information. The last thing that you want to check for each of your library branches is just the square footage down here. Again, that information should be updated, hopefully by the time that you're looking at this, by the data dump that MBLC has provided to USAC. So you should be saved the trouble of having to change it, but there's always a possibility that USAC has not put that in properly. So you want to make sure that you double check it. Now, if any of these things were wrong, what we would do at that point is click up here where it says Manage Organization. And that allows us to update any of this information. So if the address were wrong, for example, we could change the address. If we needed to change phone number or any other information like that, we could change that. We can also change all of the things that I was just telling you to look at in terms of your library subtype. So if, for example, this were a kiosk or a bookmobile, we could check the boxes associated with that. You have the option to put in your FSCS number here, which is the number used by IMLS to identify your library. I don't urge that you do so, simply because how many unique identifiers do we need for each particular library in this database? That would be unique identifier number 3, because we also have your FCC registration number listed in here. In terms of the category 2 information that we talked about, you can modify your square footage if that information is for whatever reason wrong. You can also search for a school district if the school district is that's listed is not the correct school district. You can go ahead and do a search here to find the correct school district. And we already talked about how your FCC registration number is already part of this information. We're not going to change anything here. Actually, you know what? Let's change something and just show you what that looks like. We'll update our square footage to 3,500 and click submit. It asks us to give a nickname to it, which is their way of forcing you to put a title on the modification you've made. So I'm going to say updated square footage. Click submit. And we're done. And you'll see that the square footage down here at the bottom has now been updated to 3,500 square feet. All right, most of you are not library systems. Most of you are going to be individual libraries. And the process for individual libraries looks almost exactly the same. It's just that there's one less layer of abstraction. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in as an individual library. And you'll see that now instead of saying library system, it has our individual library information here. I can go ahead and click on that individual library. And instead of having to go in and look at the additional information and find all the different library outlets, it just has the one library outlet. All the information is right here for the library outlet. And if I need to modify any of that information, I can do so here by clicking on the down arrow and just selecting Manage Organization, and it takes me to the exact same screen that we were looking at before. Again, I know this can be a little bit confusing. The point here is to just make sure that you have all the correct information in EPC. You have a little bit of time before this needs to be done. USAC opens what they call an administrative window. That window opened about 2 weeks ago and will close in early to mid-January. And so what you want to be sure is that all of this information is correct before that window closes. All right. A couple other things. And I should have actually done this a second ago. My apologies. All right, let's go back in here. I'm going to log back in as, oh, that was not what I meant to do. All right. So if I go back out of here, instead of managing the organization, when you are looking at your individual library page or your library system page, you will note that you have the option here to create new users, add or remove existing users, and manage user permissions up here at the top. You can also get to that if you are on the landing page, which is what they call the home page for your library. So when you first log in, that's where you'll end up, is on this landing page. You can also get to it by clicking on Manage Users up here at the top, which then you select your library system or your individual library, and you have your options of create a user, add or remove existing users, or manage user permissions. Once you are an administrator for a library within Epic, you have the ability to create additional user accounts. And so you will find that you end up doing that if there are other people who are working on your E-rate process. For example, if someone else is handling the billing and invoicing side of things, or if you have multiple people who are working on putting together the forms asking for the services that you want, you end up needing to create additional user accounts. It's actually very straightforward how to do that. You would simply click on create a new user. And again, as we talked about before, it basically asks you for contact information for the person. The most critical piece of that contact information is the email address, because the email address is used as the unique identifying key for every user account, which means that that email address can't get reused. You can't transfer it to somebody else. it is a one-time use only, where whoever you have identified using that email address is going to be the person who is associated with that user account. That email address is going to be their username, all of that kind of stuff. What that means in more concrete terms: don't use a generic email address like library@libraryname.ma.us. Use an actual user account, because if you have just a generic account, when that person switches, when someone else becomes the go-to person within your library, technically they're not allowed to use, the new person is not allowed to use the old account, because the old account is actually linked to a person, even though you used a generic email address. So that's how you set up a new account. And again, you'll see the information is all pretty straightforward. Where the rubber hits the road on this stuff is the permissions that you give to a user account. And those permissions basically indicate which forms they're able to interact with in the E-rate process. We went through very briefly what those forms are during the last training, and we will spend a ton of time on that in the upcoming trainings. But the key thing to keep in mind is that you have the ability to fine-tune what pieces of your E-rate application process each user can interact with. In most cases, you're not going to need to do that. In most cases, you're probably only going to have one or two people who interact with the E-rate process, and they're probably going to do a little bit of everything. However, you need to make sure that you set the permissions properly to allow them to do that. So for each of these forms, you'll see that there are different levels of rights. Full rights users have the ability to complete anything in the form and file it. Partial rights users have the ability to complete anything in the form, but not to file it. And view-only users, as you can probably guess, can only view the information. They can't fill anything out. That terminology is used pretty consistently throughout the process and throughout all of the different forms, with the exception of the Form 498, where you have the options are school or library official, general financial contact, or no access. The Form 498 is something we'll talk about in just a minute, so don't worry about that too much. You do have the ability to just give somebody blanket access to everything by going to the far left side and selecting Apply All. And if you select Full, you'll note that it just gives them full rights for everything except for the 498. For the 498, it gives them the equivalent of full by saying that they have the school or library official designation. So let me cancel out of that real quickly. Let me show you again the other option that you have is to manage user permissions. You have three, actually. You can add or remove existing users, which doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. And you can manage user permissions. To manage user permissions, it just allows you to take an existing user and assign the rights that you wanted. So for example, there's only one user that's associated with this particular account. That user has full rights to everything except for the bear and the 498. If I needed to change it so that they had full rights for the bear and the 498, I could either go to the far left, select full, and that would give them rights for everything, or I could go in individually and select full and school or library official on the 498. When I hit submit, it goes ahead and changes the rights that that user has in the system. Okay. So that's everything you need to know about getting set up in Epic, getting ready for the E-rate application process. And the slides sort of cover all of that with the different steps. I know that's a lot of information to cover. Again, the whole point of the materials being set out the way they are is so that you can refer back to them. A couple of other quick things about Epic. Timing is everything. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that now is probably the worst possible time for us to be having this particular training, if only because Epic is going to be going offline later this week. They're doing some updates to the system, so they're going to take it down for a couple of days. So my advice to you would be, don't worry about this stuff until after the Epic system comes back up, which will be either on the 6th or on the 7th. So it's supposed to be closed through the 6th. If they finish early, it may come back up on the 6th. But you can wait until next week to go ahead and verify that all your information is correct within Epic. As I mentioned before, MBLC has reached out to USAC, has provided them with a ton of information about updates that need to be made to library information. USAC has agreed to make those updates, but as of yesterday, the updates are not yet complete. They should hopefully be complete within the next week, although we don't have a firm commitment from USAC on that. If you go into Epic and you find that the information for your library is inaccurate and you want to find out if we asked for it to be updated, please don't hesitate. Just reach out to me directly, and I can check it and tell you if the information was part of the update that USAC was supposed to make, or whether it's something that we missed. All right, so far we've covered 2 accounts, the FCC registration number and Epic. And technically, those are the only things you need to get started in the E-rate process. However, I want to talk about another account that you may also need from SAM.gov, which is SAM.gov is a government-wide entity database used by the feds for a wide variety of grant opportunities and other federal funding mechanisms. As I mentioned before, technically you don't need SAM.gov to get started in the E-rate process. However, I'm going to urge you to sign up for a SAM.gov account now, because it may be required at the end of the process, depending on how you've got your invoicing set up. If you are going to be receiving funding directly from the E-rate program, then you need to have an account set up in SAM.gov. SAM.gov, much like EPC, has both individual accounts that you register for as an individual, and then entity accounts, which would be for your library. And you need to have an individual account set up as the administrator for that library entity. Unlike EPC or the FCC registration number, SAM.gov has these entity accounts set up such that they expire every single year. So every year you need to go in and renew the account. So it's entirely possible that you may already have an account set up in SAM.gov based on other funding that you receive. It's also possible that you do not. So just like we did with the FCC registration number, one of the things we're going to do is go into SAM.gov in order to search out whether you actually have an account. Critical to this process, when you sign up for an account on SAM.gov, the individual account happens almost instantaneously. The entity account, where they verify that you are the library that you say you are, and that the information you provided for your library, that registration can take 6 weeks or more for them to process. In some instances, it actually takes months for them to process. And that's part of why I'm urging you to go ahead and apply for that SAM.gov account now. You may not need it until a year from now, but once you have it set up, the renewal process isn't so hard. But if you don't have it set up and you've got a deadline coming up, that delay in the registration process can be a real killer. So as you might have guessed from the name, for SAM.gov, the way you get to it is by going to the website, SAM.gov. The first thing you need to do is go ahead and sign up for that individual account. And the reason you need to do that is in order for you to search effectively within the SAM.gov database, you need to be logged into an account. So if you don't already have a SAM.gov account, you can go ahead and register for one very quickly. You can do that by go ahead and clicking the sign in button at the top right of the page. On the page that comes up, you'll have a pop-up that allows you to either sign in if you're an existing user or create an account. So if you go ahead and click on create an account there, it asks you for your email address, it asks you to accept the terms and conditions, and then you click submit. It then creates an account for you and sends you an email with a link. You open that email, you click on the link, and it asks you to set a password. The password, pretty standard again, needs to be a strong password, 12 characters or more, has a lot of the same requirements that you had for the FCC registration number, or frankly, that you'll have within EPC, that we see on pretty much every system these days for passwords. It then asks you, after you set your password and click continue, it asks you to set up your authentication method, which is just your two-factor authentication. You can do an app, you can do text messages, you can have a list of backup codes, you can do a security fob. Whatever method you want to use works, but you will need to have access to that method every time you choose to log in. So just like your bank or any other federal secure database. Once you finally set up all of that, you can go ahead and agree and to all of the terms of service and continue. It then asks you to complete your profile. That's just all of your standard address information, phone number, all of that kind of stuff. Click submit. At that point, you've created your individual account within SAM.gov. Now, let me get to SAM.gov. I'm going to log into my account. Oh, hold on just a second. My password database locked up on me. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my SAM.gov account. It's going to send me, I've used email for the authentication. So it is sending me an email separately. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up real quickly. I'm doing that hopefully off screen, so you're not seeing my email. It can often take a minute or two, just like any email authentication, to come through. So give me just a second here. Make sure it didn't go into spam. It did not. Okay.
So Alec, the page here says it sent you a text.
Okay, so that's interesting because it doesn't send me a text. It sends me an email. I'm guessing that is a bit of weirdness at their end for whatever reason. But let's go ahead and I just got the confirmation email. Oh, I thought I did. Let's try that again. All right, it doesn't look like the confirmation is coming through. Let's have it send it again. My apologies. All right. Oh, the email came through quite quickly this time. All right. Let's go ahead and click submit. Great. And that has taken me into my account. It has all the information there, yada, yada, yada. All right. That should have taken me back to SAM.gov. So let's make sure we're signed in. Sorry, I'm going to sign in again because it didn't take me where I thought it was going to take me. Sorry, folks, that's the downside of trying to do these live demonstrations is you get to see exactly how interesting some of these live demonstrations can be and see that even those of us who deal with these systems on an almost daily basis get to deal with some of the same frustrations that you will. So let's see if that code works. Perfect. All right. So once you are signed into an account, you can go ahead and do a search. And you actually have the ability to do a more meaningful search. Because if you aren't logged into an account, you don't have the ability to filter your criteria. And so that leads to all kinds of problems where, for example, you can't search for just entities. You can just search on a keyword. In our case, we're only interested in entities. So we'll click on where it says select domains. We'll click on entity information. And then we'll do a keyword for Swampscott. Now, you can look for only active entities or active and inactive entities. In this case, I'm going to select active and inactive, just in case the library had one already. And it's lost my Swampscott here, so I'm going to put that back in. I'm going to hit return. And it now shows there are 82 results where the word Swampscott appears. The first one here is the town of Swampscott, which may well be the one that we want, but we can also see that it's an inactive registration. If we wanted to find out more about that particular entity, we can click on where it says Swampscott Town of, and we can pull up all of their information and figure out, who we need to contact about getting the information updated. In this case, let's see. Yes, the point of contact is listed here, so we would know who we would need to contact to go ahead and get the information updated if we were using the town of Swampscott. I'm going to go back. And if we look and do a search through here, we'll see that there are a variety of other entities that also have these SAM.gov entities set up. I know from looking at this that the library in Swampscott is not one of them. So they may need to set up an entity ID. If they did need to set up an entity ID, let me get to there. You will need to then go ahead and create one. The process is not terribly complicated once you have an account set up within SAM.gov. I've linked to a YouTube video that walks you through that process, just because it is a lot of different steps that you need to go through. And I didn't want to add another 30 slides to this presentation. So I would urge you to look at that YouTube video. It's pretty straightforward. The key things that you're going to need your employer identification number, which again, we used for the FCC registration number already. So you should have that handy, and what's called a cage code if you already have one. If you don't have one, don't worry about it. You can get one assigned during the process. The last piece of information that you're going to need here, which you may not have readily available, is your bank information. They will ask for an account type, a routing number, and an account number. And again, remember, this is because we're setting up this SAM.gov account in part so that you can receive transfers from the feds directly for your E-rate discounts. As I mentioned just a moment ago, there's a lot of information included in this registration process. Most of what they ask about doesn't actually apply to libraries. They use the same registration information for a whole variety of different kinds of entities. So you'll find you end up leaving a lot of the information blank. Once you've completed all of it and you submit it, they will start processing it. And again, that registration can take 6 weeks or more. In that process, they will reach out to you or whoever you've set up as the contact to verify various pieces of information. Most of the time, this process goes very smoothly. And 6 weeks later, you have your SAM.gov account set up for your entity, and you are issued what is called a UEI, a unique entity identifier, which again, for those of you keeping track at home, that would be unique identifier number 4 that we're talking about for your library so far today. For some entities, this process just doesn't end up working. If that is the case, reach out to MBLC and we will help you through that process. We may end up asking you to reach out to some other folks to also assist you, such as your congressional representatives. We may reach out to your congressional representatives on your behalf, because sometimes it requires a little bit of pressure coming from the top to get these numbers put through the process. But the process does generally end up working. It just takes a little while. Again, this is why it's really important to register for this SAM.gov account as soon as you can and make sure that your entity is listed in SAM.gov.
So Alec, before we move on from the UEIs, I have a question.
Yes.
So for our libraries who participate in our LSTA program, we also need to collect a UEI. But in that case, we always have the one for the town because the money goes to the town. In this case, the library needs to have its own.
So that depends on how the system, how the library is set up in relationship to the town. As long as the two share an account or share an EIN, you can use the same UEI that you would use for LSTA. If, however, the library has a separate account or has a separate EIN, then you would want the library to have its own UEI set up through SAM.gov. That's a great question. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to everybody else. So for most municipal libraries, if your payroll is done through the town, then you will share an EIN and you can use their UEI.
Right.
So basically, I was going to ask the same question. So basically, we go into SAM.gov and we see our town in there. We can just use that. We don't have to create a new account.
Yeah, assuming that you guys share an EIN.
We do. Let's just say that.
And that it's okay for the funding related to your library to be transferred into the bank account that the town has registered, then that's no problem. All right. I promise you we're almost at the end. I want to talk about one more account that I've called it, which isn't really an account, it's actually a form. It's the Form 498, which you will also file at some point within EPC. The Form 498 is where USAC requests your banking information, and we'll cover this in a subsequent training. But if you are going into EPC and you wanted to file your Form 498, you can do that at any time. Basically, the process is that you fill out the Form 498, which includes basically just your contact information, your bank account number, and your bank routing number. After that, there is a very poorly documented step where they will send you a link, and at that link, you need to upload a copy of a voided check or similar proof of your account information. And when I say this is poorly documented, I mean, it doesn't even tell you that that's what they're asking you to upload. So be aware that that is what they're asking for at that point. Your Form 498 is also not needed until the invoicing piece of the process. So if you are not already participating in E-rate, you're not going to need this for at least another 18 months. So don't worry about it at this point. But I wanted to make you aware that that is an additional requirement that comes through here. The critical thing with the Form 498 from the perspective of the stuff that we've just been talking about is you want to be sure that the bank account number and routing information that you upload in the Form 498 matches the bank account number and routing information that is in SAM.gov for your UEI. All right. A couple more quick things to talk about before we finish up. What you need to do, the sort of do's and don'ts of the process of getting ready for procurement. Again, we will talk about procurement in much more detail in just 2 weeks' time. So watch for the announcement of the next training where we will talk about procurement and walk through filing the first form in the process. However, in order to be ready to do that, there are a couple steps that you should take ahead of time. First, you should go over the eligible services list, which was in the prior presentation, and the slides from that are still available from the MBLC website. And go over the eligible services list itself, which was linked out of that presentation. If you can't find it, let me know. I'll be happy to send you a copy of it. It's still not finalized, which is a little bit distressing, but it should be finalized in the coming weeks, and we're not expecting any significant changes for libraries. Once you've reviewed what's eligible, you should figure out what are the services that you're interested in applying for E-rate for. So in category 1, are you looking at transport, meaning the underlying data connection? Are you looking at internet access? Or are you looking at both? For whichever services you're looking at, what speeds and what bandwidth are you looking for? and what locations are you looking to have served? So where's your library? What speed service are you looking for? And do you want transport or internet? If you were applying for category 2, which would be things like routers and switches and Wi-Fi, you should figure out the quantity, make, and model of the equipment that you're interested in receiving. Remember, as we talked about a little bit last time, as we will talk about in much more detail in 2 weeks, you are allowed to identify your preferred solution, but you are also required to consider equivalent options. So you won't necessarily be able to specify exactly what you want and require that vendors bid that. However, we'll talk about ways to make that work for you in the next presentation. You also figure out whether you need installation and configuration of that equipment and what locations that you'll be installing it at. If you are a library network and you are applying on behalf of any of your members, you need to make sure you have letters of agency. And if you don't already have letters of agency and we haven't talked about it, feel free to reach out to me directly and I can help you with that process. There are a couple other things to just mention briefly. There are some state master contracts in the state of Massachusetts, which we will talk about in much more detail in 2 weeks. They mostly cover connectivity. And so we'll talk about contract ITT 72 and how you can use that to help get some of the connectivity needs for your library if you are so inclined. The reason we're not talking about it today, in addition to running short of time, is that MBLC is still working through exactly how to make those interact properly with E-rate. Again, we'll provide more information in the next training. So I've put together some quick do's and don'ts. As we just talked about, you need to figure out, you should, as a do, figure out what you need, what equipment you need to purchase or what equipment needs to be replaced, and then put together that list of goods and services you're interested in. You should also make sure you do your own research on the services that you want to procure. And what I mean by that is you do the research, you don't have a vendor do it for you. You should answer a couple of questions about the services that you want to procure. Do you need licenses? If you need licenses, what are the license terms? In other words, how long are those licenses going to last? What are the different options available for that? Are you going to need someone to install and configure the equipment for you, or are you going to install and configure it yourself? You should also put together all of your existing contracts and any equipment inventories and get them all together in one place to figure out what are your existing expirations for any contracts you have in place, any licenses you have, if you have hardware that's coming up on end of life, all that kind of information. It's basically, for those of you who have been around for a long time, it's doing your technology assessment that we used to require as part of your technology planning process many moons ago. What are the things you definitely should not do? You shouldn't talk with service providers at this point about what you might want to procure. That includes seeking advice from many service providers on the options that they offer. And most importantly, don't ask for quotes. Even if you're just looking at it from a budgetary perspective, don't communicate with service providers about the services that you're interested in receiving. The reason for that is that no service provider should have information in advance about the services that you want to buy. The services, the information about those services should go to all the service providers who are interested or become available to all the service providers at the same time. And so you just don't want to communicate with service providers in advance because that can contaminate the bidding process. Last, do not accept any gifts from service providers or potential service providers. That includes things like meals, in addition to the things that we normally think of as gifts. There are strict restrictions in place around gifts for the E-rate process, and you are allowed to accept some gifts. You're allowed to accept gifts worth up to $20 up to twice a year from a single service provider, but you need to document it. The much better policy that you should have in place is that you should not accept any gifts at all from potential service providers at any point, just so that you can then demonstrate that your bid process was not influenced by the receipt of gifts from your service provider. With that, I'm going to close out with a couple of final thoughts. First, the next training, we're going to talk about requests for proposal and state master contracts. We're going to talk about Forms 470, which is the bid form within the E-rate process, and bid evaluation. So we'll cover all of those in a great deal more detail. So if you are holding off on filing your Form 470 until we cover that in training, you're in luck. In roughly 2 weeks, we're going to be hitting that and covering that piece of the process in detail. The next couple trainings that we have lined up, which will be following the training coming in 2 weeks, will cover things like contracts and the Form 471 and all of the subsequent steps in the E-rate process. So we are going to walk you through the whole process, soup to nuts, starting with the next training. In preparation for that training, you should make sure that all of the entity information we went over today is complete and that you've set up all of the accounts that we've talked about. In particular, make sure that you have your FCC registration number, that the information in EPC is complete, and if you can, go ahead and get your SAM.gov information set up if it's not already complete. Don't be afraid to ask questions as we go through this process. Yesterday, we launched the E-rate mailing list. If you are not on the E-rate mailing list, you can reach out to me or Kate, and we can refer you to where you can subscribe to it. We'll get you approved. That's where we're going to share information about deadlines that are coming up in the program, about changes in the program, when documents like the eligible services list become available. So please join us on the mailing list. If you have questions, you can also ask those questions on the mailing list, and we will get back to you and share that information with you and your colleagues. If you have questions that you would rather not share with your colleagues, go ahead and contact me directly, and I will respond to you directly. As always, you should make sure that you stay in control of and monitor your E-rate applications. You should know what's going on with your E-rate applications at all times. E-rate can benefit you, and if you can make E-rate work for you, please do take advantage of it. It can have a pretty significant financial impact in both the short and long term. In the short term, if you're just applying for your Category 1 services, it can save you several $1,000s on that. But more importantly, as we talked about in the last session where we talked with some of the libraries who have made extensive use of Category 2, E-rate can help you pay for a lot of the technology that you need to put into your libraries to make internet more effectively available to your library users. Last but not least, as always, I want to know if there are other topics that you want us to cover during these trainings. So if you think of something that you would like to see us cover, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or reach out to Kate. We are eager to make sure that these trainings are as useful to you as possible. And so if there are topics or formats or anything else that you want to see included in these trainings, just let us know. So with that, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and stick around to take any questions that folks might have once Kate finishes the recording. And again, thank you so much for coming. We greatly appreciate it.
Yes, thanks everybody. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.